Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 316. This week the questions are taken from Guide 391, which is on the Japanese Navy's A150, occasionally called Super Yamato project, and the video on the development of ironclads, in broadly speaking, is at the 1870s in the Royal Navy. So let's see what the questions hold for us this week. Cap 198462 asks, many dry docks ago someone asked, are you looking forward to any revelations from the expiry of the 90-year rule? What I'd like to know is, do you anticipate any earth-shattering revelations on the order of Bletchley Park and Ultra about the period of the Second World War? Potentially, yes, but also potentially no. I mean, the thing is, Bletchley Park and Ultra were absolutely massive game changers. You look at the histories of the Second World War that were written before that, and it was assumed that there was a colossal network of spies, and somehow, given the amount of information, you'd think we'd have spies in every single German port, airfield, and division, and presumably absolutely blanketing Northern Europe with radio traffic. And no one really seemed to question that, up until it turns out, actually, we were just reading the Germans' codes. But that's long since been declassified. Now, when the UK government, or indeed the US government, because depending on which government you look at, they have slightly different rules, when they classify something that's either for 90 or 100 years, it's generally speaking to do with something that is either considered so potentially open for retribution that the sort of the unofficial moniker is until everybody involved and their direct dependents are dead, which makes sense at 90 to 100 years, because if you're, let's say you're in your 30s-ish, which is probably about the age you need to be involved in some at least responsible for the really interesting shenanigans that governments get up to, then reasonably speaking, if your report is concluded and everything's filed away shortly thereafter, so let's say when you're in your late 30s or so, then if you had a kid or two who was maybe in single digits or early teens, which might be expected by your late 30s, then under the 90 to 100 year rule, theoretically that child could still be alive, but they'd have to be either a centenarian or older, which, and even if you had a child a little bit later on, they'd still have to be in their late 80s or early 90s. And that pretty much removes both the people involved and their direct family from potential retribution by state actors who may still want revenge a century later for perceived slights. So I suspect there's probably some very spicy stuff locked up behind those rules, but that is probably going to be related to specific operations at a much lower level. Now, perhaps some of the objectives of those operations might be interesting, but maybe not earth-shattering to the level of Bletchley Park and Ultra. The thing is, of course, if they've kept the secret this long, if there is some kind of operation that merits this level of classification that is on a scale of Bletchley Park or Ultra or larger, it would be so mind-bogglingly, ridiculously changing the history of the Second World War that at this stage we probably couldn't even conceive of it. You'd be talking like Stargate program levels of change that we'd have to be factoring in. And of course, there is the very real possibility that, as seems potentially to have happened with one or two of the documents surrounding Glorious's sinking, where there are documents that aren't classified under a given rule, but some of the ones relating to a specific operation are, when they've eventually been released, either at 50, 70, 90, whatever years, it seems that sometimes certain pages within those documents have mysteriously vanished in the intervening however long. So it may be that there is something absolutely mind-boggling that's been classified away, but it has perhaps been classified away to allow for people to destroy part of the document that would be the real mind blower. And then by the time the rest of it is declassified, people go, hey, where's this missing page or two? Well, probably the person who took that page out is dead, and so their motivations and where that page went, if it didn't just go straight to the fireplace, have probably also gone with them. So it's going to be a real minefield. Brendan Buersdorf asks, Japanese Army aircraft used an upscaled Browning machine gun modified into several calibers, the HO-103 in 12.7mm, the HO-5 in 20mm, and the HO-155 in 30mm, all on the same basic design, just scaled up or down for caliber. If the Japanese Navy had borrowed this design for use as an anti-aircraft weapon, could it have been more effective than the Type 96 25mm despite having a lower range? The Browning is a known design and belt-fed and fairly reliable, so something based off that style of action definitely seems to have some potential. Theoretically, yes. The biggest issue, though, would be the fact that certainly the autocannons, the HO-5 and the HO-155, entered service either, in the HO-5's case, in the same year as Japan got involved in World War II, or in the HO-155's case, partway during it. Now, of course, having a anti-aircraft cannon that enters service pretty much at the start of the war, or just into it, isn't necessarily a deal breaker. I mean, look at the 40mm Bofors. However, Japanese industry is not American industry. So my biggest concern in this case would be whether or not Japan could actually build enough of them, considering they are also in demand for use on aircraft as well. The HO-103 I wouldn't use because ultimately it is a heavy machine gun, and heavy machine guns, even in the beginning of World War II, are really too short range. And the HO-155 enters service, I think, far too late to make any real difference. But the HO-5, the 20mm variant, that definitely has some potential if manufacturing at scale can be done. Because, yes, it is a shorter range, lower velocity weapon than the 25mm, but it can, as you say, fire from a belt, so you're not going to get those annoying interruptions from constantly having to slam fresh clips or magazines in. It's a considerably smaller and lighter weapon, which means you could put even more of them on, or develop, twin, triple, quadruple mounts, that kind of stuff. And it does have a, frankly, ridiculous rate of fire for a 20mm Oerlikon. Now, that may work against it if somebody just holds the trigger down. They'll run out of ammo fairly quickly. But in theory, combined with its light weight, it would mean you could potentially have twin mounts that actually probably wouldn't weigh that much more than a single Oerlikon, because it is also quite a lightweight weapon. And of course, being man-portable, shoulder mount like the single 20mm Oerlikon, you could aim those pretty quickly, track pretty quickly, and you could then fire bursts, which would conserve your ammunition, and theoretically, although this might be a little bit difficult, you could, with a twin mount certainly, perhaps exhaust one and let your guy reload, but still have some shells in the other one in case you need to quickly spring back into action. It's not great, but potentially. The single biggest issue would be the relative to the 25mm and even the 20mm Oerlikon, the slightly slower muzzle velocity and therefore shorter range and longer travel time of the shells. I suppose you could try and just make a slightly longer barrel to try and address that, but if we're using the base model gun, that would be the one concern, in that you would end up with it being outranged somewhat faster than even the 20mm Oerlikon was, so it might be a reasonably effective early war weapon, say in 42 and maybe 43, but you would want something a bit bigger going forward, especially once you get Avengers beginning to lob torpedoes from high and fast rather than low and slow. John Smith asks, if your desired armour thickness is a bit more than your steel industry can make, and you're forced to use inefficient multiple layers, is it better to have each layer be half the desired thickness, or for one layer to be the maximum thickness you can make and the second to be thinner just to make up the remainder? And how great is the performance difference between the two options? Now, that's a very interesting one, actually. The very precise answer involves an awful lot of complicated mathematics, because if you're, for example, using face-hardened armor, then having two separate layers of face-hardened armor, or perhaps a thicker layer of face-hardened armor and an outer layer of non-hardened, or the other way round, or two layers of thinner face-hardened armor, or even potentially using different materials, a different type of steel perhaps as the backing or fronting plate, all of that throws values around quite a bit in terms of the precise answer you're going to get for given thicknesses. And I mean, that's probably a subject for a video all of its own. However, if you assume that as a very crude rule, you're going to just use two slabs of similar armor without any other fancy gubbins getting in the way, and bear in mind this probably isn't really going to work precisely for belt armor because you really do want that to be face hardened, but the general principle will apply, just not the specific thickness that will result, or apparent thickness that will result from it. You can go to the US Navy's formula, the one that they used in the Second World War, for assuming the apparent thickness of armor when you multi-layered it. Now, this was mostly for deck armor, which was homogeneous for the most part, rather than face hardened, hence why it's very simple. And they assumed that the upper plate, in the case of deck armor, i.e. the facing plate, the one that gets hit first, had a 30% reduction in effectiveness, so it's only 70% as strong as its apparent thickness, and then you just add the lower plate, or in this case the backing plate, in terms of its thickness to that. Now, there are other formulas that you can use to work this kind of stuff out, and as I said, if you're going to use it for belt armor, you will need very complicated mathematics to work out exactly what the answers are, but the ratios should remain exactly the same. And what it turns out is that what you will want to do is get the thickest possible plate that you can make and put that as the inner layer, and then the outer layer will be whatever the remaining thickness is. So let's say you wanted 10 inches of armor. If you put 2 inches inside and 8 inches outside, the US Navy formula gives you an apparent thickness of 7.6 inches, because that's 30% taken off of 8 plus the 2. If you do it 50-50, so literally 5 inches each, you get 8.5 inches of apparent thickness. But if you put the 2-inch plate on the outside and the inner plate is 8 inches thick, you get 9.4 inches of apparent thickness, which, is only 0.6 of an inch away from the actual thickness of 10 inches. So you're not losing too much there. So you definitely want to have the thinner plate on the outside. Now, the reason why, generally speaking, when you look at deck armor, you tend to find the thicker layer is on top, which might seem to make no sense because obviously we've just indicated that's the wrong way around of doing it, is because when you're looking at the effective thickness of decks, bear in mind that the thinner, in deck's case, lower layer, is the actual deck plating itself for the ship, and what you're sticking on top of that is the armor plate. You can't do it the other way around, because otherwise either you are making the deck, the structural portion of the ship, ridiculously thick and therefore quite heavy, and it's going to be difficult to replace so it gets damaged, or you're mounting your armor plate underneath the deck plating, which is going to be very interesting in terms of supporting it, because either you're putting the deck plating on top of the armor plating on top of the beams and other supports that are holding up that deck, in which case you've just made the armor also the deck plating, or you're just bolting it to the deck plating and it's essentially otherwise just hanging in empty space, at which point a projectile doesn't actually have to defeat the armor plate, it just has to defeat the sheer strength of the bolts holding it all together. So that's why in at least deck armour, you tend to see the thicker bit stacked on top facing the bomb. Even though it's not mathematically ideal, it is structurally a better solution. Pelham Express asks, judging from this and past episodes, this is in reference to the Super Yamatos, it seems that the larger the gun system, the more complicated and demanding it becomes to construct and operate. What was the sweet spot in large naval guns? The best balance of hitting power and simplicity? Would a larger number of smaller ships armoured with more guns of a smaller calibre have been the better route than the drive towards ever larger and ever more complex guns? The sweet spot for guns moves constantly during the development of battleships. About the only time you could probably say that it lasted for any particular length of time was probably in the late 1930s, at least if you were just considering ships that were either sticking to the treaty limits or making vague attempts to. And that's simply because people were constantly up-armouring ships, and whether that be inventing new materials, compound armour, Harvey armour, and then Krupp armour for better resistance per unit thickness, or whether they were just upping the thickness, or whether they were also combining all of this with snazzy little features like inclining the armour belts. They were always looking for a way to increase the resistive power of a ship's protection. Now, obviously, what a ship can resist at long range versus medium range versus short range is going to vary, but essentially your sweet spot, at least in my opinion, is worked out by the following. Take the range that you want to fight at. So in 1900, that would be 1,500 yards. In 1910, it might be 10 or 12,000 yards. In the middle of World War I, it might be 15 to 16,000 yards. And if you are the US or Japanese navies in 1930s, it might be 25 to 30,000 yards, or possibly even longer. But select your ideal battle range. Now consider what is the armour that you are likely to face at that battle range. What is your most likely enemy equipping their ships with, or has equipped their ships with, if you're in the middle of the interwar period and there's a building holiday. Then consider what gun do you need to, within reason, relatively comfortably penetrate the enemy's armour at your chosen battle range. That's your ideal calibre to start with. Your sweet spot is probably a gun that's an inch or two larger than that. And the reason I say that is because if you go with what can penetrate your enemy's armour now, then in theory, with a relatively small upgrade in armour on their next ship, your enemy may now have a ship that can resist your firepower at your chosen battle range. Whereas if you have a gun that is just a little bit larger, then that means not only do you have even better penetration capability, so at your chosen battle range, if the enemy does something like angle their approach to you, increasing the apparent thickness of their armour, you're still going to get a penetration, and the penetrations you get broadside on broadside are potentially going to go somewhat deeper. But it also means that if your enemy brings out an iteration on their battleship design and adds half an inch or an inch of armour to their ships, your guns will still have a relatively decent chance of penetrating at your expected battle range. This is perhaps much more easily seen in the naval arms races leading up to the First World War, because guns are long lead items, but also the designs of ships tend to get locked in, a year or so, ideally, before they're actually laid down. So if you can conceal the true size of your guns long enough for your enemy to make their long-term orders for their own guns and armour, then you can maintain this advantage. This is why the 13.5 inch, for example, was initially a 12 inch 50 special, and why the 15 inch 42 was a 13.5 inch special. Because if your enemy is trying to armour themselves against 12 inch gunfire and you rock up with a 13.5, guess what? You win. And if your enemy is now trying to armour against 13.5 inch armour and you rock up with a 15 inch gun, once again, you win. So obviously you can see that if you then build a 15-inch gun, let's say, or in the interwar period going towards, at the beginning of World War II, either a high-velocity 15-inch or a 16-inch weapon, then that is your sweet spot, but that only remains your sweet spot until your enemy starts deploying ships which at reasonable battle ranges can withstand 15 or 16-inch gunfire, and then your sweet spot has moved up. So in terms of, is it better to have smaller ships with more smaller guns or fewer ships with really big guns? Bearing in mind everything we've just said, what you effectively have to do if you really, really want smaller ships with smaller guns is establish what is your minimum floor, as in the minimum caliber of gun you need to penetrate at a decent battle range. Because there's no point building, let's say, if your opponent is building let's say a 45,000 ton ship armed with 16-inch guns, there's no point in you building 3 15,000 ton ships armed with 12-inch guns if your opponent's armor is essentially immune to 12-inch gunfire at reasonable battle ranges, because at that point you've just got to hope to plaster your enemy and break his fire control systems before he blows you clean out of the water, which is not something you really want to bet your national security on. Whereas if, again, let's say your opponent is building a 45,000 ton ship armed with 16-inch guns, if you have a 14-inch gun lying around, and at your expected battle range that 14-inch gun can punch through your 45,000 ton opponent's armor, and you can build your 14-inch ship on, let's say, 30,000 tons. So if your opponent builds 2 45,000 tonners for the same tonnage, you can build 3 30,000 tonners. Then it might be worth building your smaller ships armed with lots of 14-inch guns. However, there is still the caveat to that, which is that if your opponent goes, yeah, okay, that's cute, now here's my 50,000 ton ship, which still has 16-inch guns, but I've slapped another 3 inches of armor on it, now all your small ships are pretty useless for a relatively minimal extra investment by your opponent. So you always have to be careful when trying to take the more but smaller guns approach. Joshua Vinicum asks, from memory, I think you've said that World War II American ship armor was different in performance to Japanese armor of the same era. For example, 12 inches of one nation's armor is not necessarily the same as 12 inches of the other nation's armor in resisting penetration. What are the two nations doing differently to get different results out of their steel? The full answer is a rather long and very engineering heavy video, which I've been working on and off the script for probably a couple of years at this point. But the short version is that, at least for World War II, you are looking at a few different primary factors. Now, there are lots of other factors, and how they all interplay with each other does also make a big difference. But a short partial summary of the bigger factors, let's say, if you were to stick a slab of American 12-inch battleship armor from a battleship's belt against a Japanese equivalent and shoot at them, and you don't use any fancy exterior gubbins like, you know, angling the armor or whatever, so you're just looking at the resistive values of these plates. One thing is, how deep is the face-hardened layer? Now, in that particular respect, that's actually a mark against the US, because the US actually, for various reasons, went with a slightly too deep hardened layer compared to the Japanese. So that would mark the American plate down somewhat. But there's a lot of other things as well. You've also got to take into account how that face transitions to the softer backing. If it transitions too fast, you could get shearing, the support won't quite be there. If it transitions too gradually, you can end up with excessive thickness of steel that is a little bit too brittle to be supportive and a little bit too soft to be resistive. Then you've also got the actual quality of the steel itself. So you can take scrap steel, newly made steel, steel made from really good quality ore, steel made from really rubbish ore with really high impurity levels. But essentially, what is your manufacturing and treatment process? how much of those unwanted impurities, slag inclusions, etc., are you getting out of the steel in your manufacturing process? Because in theory, if you have a really poor quality control process, you could start off with some of the best quality iron ore in the business and end up with a fairly terrible steel at the end of it. Conversely, if you have really good quality control, you could take some of the worst iron ore out there and actually have some pretty decent steel by the end of it. Then you've got to take into account things like how are you actually treating your steel. So how hard are you making that face? You know, it's not just a case of the depth and the transition. It's also how hard is it? Because ideally you want it to be as hard as possible, but you don't want to go too far over so that it shatters like glass, but essentially just one step back from that. But how much of a risk are you taking pushing towards that essentially failure point? Obviously, the two different nations have different approaches to that. In fact, sometimes different manufacturers could have different approaches. There's obviously overall quality, you know, how consistent is each plate. Is one plate coming out really, really good and the next really rubbish, or are they all coming out at a similar standard? And you've also got to take into account what else is in that steel. So we've talked about the unwanted impurities, but what about the impurities you do want to introduce? Small traces of nickel, chromium, molybdenum, etc., beyond the basic carbon and iron that makes up steel. That recipe, if you like, for steel will result in different qualities to that steel, some absolute in terms of ultimate tensile strength and so forth, and some more behavioral. So some steels might lend themselves to potentially hardening more than others. Other steels might be a little bit more ductile at the back, and the exact thickness of the face-on section relative to the backing section might vary a little bit depending on the quality of the steel you're using in terms of all those little extra trace elements you've added in. And that's just the beginning. You can see why this needs to be a whole video in and of itself. But throw all those factors together and bear in mind that almost every single one of those factors was different between the US and Japan. And that's why if you stick 12 inches of face-hardened Japanese plate, American plate, German plate, British plate, Italian plate, etc., you will get different results from each one, assuming you're using exactly the same projectile to try and penetrate each test unit. R. de Boer asks, had British battlecruiser designers sacrificed some speed for armour, roughly how much extra tonnage in protection could they have had while still being effective in the battlecruiser role? And was this feasible for Royal Navy shipbuilders at the time? So without going into extremely detailed design calculations, it is a little difficult to estimate. You can ballpark it by looking at the various alternate design options for specific ship classes, particularly obviously the battle cruisers. Although there is, of course, the caveat even there that quite often the different designs would have different dimensions and different displacements. And so part of the difference in protection might come from the fact that a shorter ship obviously might not need quite as much armor in terms of surface area. A larger ship would potentially need more, unless the larger ship is considered particularly thinly protected or whatever. But looking at what's available easily for the various design options for the British World War I era battle cruisers, it seems that an extra inch of belt protection is worth between 500 to 800 tons of displacement, trending a little bit more towards the higher end. So maybe if we say 650 to 700 tons as a safe estimate for how much you'd have to pay for an extra inch of armor. Now, some of that could be eaten up by the board margin, i.e. the realm, the kind of safety margin that you build into designs when it comes to warships, certainly at this period. But it is going to exceed that board margin somewhat. And again, very roughly ballparking, because I'm not going to sit down and do 2 days worth of design calculations for 5 minutes of question answering. I apologize. But ballparking, looking at ships that completed overweight and how much speed they lost, and ships that completed a bit underweight and how much faster they were able to go, you're probably talking, depending on where all this weight is going and how that might affect things, you're probably talking at about between half a knot and a knot of speed. So again, if we try to sort of play it safe and say maybe 3/4 of a knot of speed, 2/3 to 3/4. Now, on something like the Invincibles, I don't think there really is any margin to up armor them, because their whole purpose is to be just that little bit faster that they can catch armored cruisers. If you start to drop that speed by any amount, then, well, you'll retain a small margin of speed superiority, but not enough really to catch an enemy who's evading you. And also, to be perfectly honest, whether the Invincibles have 6 inches or 7 inches of armor really isn't going to change all that much, because neither of those thicknesses is really adequate against 11 or 12-inch gunfire. But when you get to Lion, Princess Royal, Queen Mary, and Tiger, things are slightly different, because now you're looking at 9 inches of armor, but you're also looking at 27.5 or more knots of speed. Now, we know that the 9-inch belt was just about capable of keeping out 12-inch gunfire at longer ranges, and it was okay at dealing with 11-inch gunfire to the belt. We know this because, various of the British 13.5-inch battlecruisers took hits to the belt from German 11 and 12-inch guns, and the belt armor worked. Now, with that said, in some cases it was only marginal, so you could, I would reckon, add an inch, so take them up to 10 inches of belt armor, and you drop your design speed at that point to just under 27 knots, maybe 26.5 knots, and then based on the historical performance of the Lions on their trials, you'd end up with a trial speed of maybe just over, so you'd end up with maybe a trial speed of 27.25 knots or something like that. That would still be fine for general battlecruiser missions, and specifically for going after the real-world speeds of German battlecruisers of roughly contemporaneous vintage, i.e. the Moltkers for the Lions, rather than the absurd trial speeds they got. But that's a separate matter which we've discussed in other questions. And as a result, yeah, you could potentially make the argument that the Lions, Queen Mary, and Tiger could have got 10 inches of protection, which would have given them comfortable protection against 11-inch gunfire, as well as a somewhat better margin against 12-inch. Pushing it further to 11 inches with the 13.5-inch guns and the speed that they're supposed to go at, I think you'd be getting into dangerous territory there. You'd be talking about dropping their speed to a point where even with the real-world speed of German battlecruisers, you have no real margin of superiority over them at all. Potentially a slight inferiority, no real margin of speed for future developments. But of course, all of this is just looking purely at assuming the hull and everything else remains the same. You're just slapping slightly thicker belt plates on it. Realistically, could you get an 11-inch armed British battlecruiser with a, maybe 27-knot top speed and a slight increase in displacement? Possibly, if you can persuade. That's entirely possible if you can persuade the Treasury to pay for it. So yes, it's feasible, but you are talking either about surrendering a slight margin of your top speed advantage or paying a bit more for somewhat larger ships. Samoilenko asks, it's usually said that the Citadel has enough buoyancy to keep the ship afloat, even if the other compartments are flooded. Does it mean that all the ships with Citadels that were ever sunk had their Citadels breached, or are there other factors such as flooding dispersion and the role of the ship? And if it is so, is it really beneficial to have the Citadel buoyancy advantage described above? The general design guidance from Warrior onwards for most capital ships was to have it so that the unarmoured or lightly armoured portions would be riddled and completely flooded, but the Citadel would keep the ship afloat. Not every ship with an armoured Citadel was capable of staying afloat with the ends riddled, because one of the other things the Citadel protects is your machinery and your magazines, and sometimes you concentrate that Citadel with really thick armor just over those bits, and you actually end up with a Citadel that can't keep you afloat if it's the only thing that remains unbreached, Bismarck being an example of that. And so when you look at some World War I and some World War II capital ship designs, you can get ships that are designed at roughly the same time, one of which will be able to stay afloat with its Citadel unbreached, the other of which won't, assuming that everything is flooding in a relatively general fashion. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that all ships with Citadels that were ever sunk had their Citadels breached, because, as I said, some ships could sink without their Citadels being breached. But also, it was possible, even with a ship that should be okay, to sink a vessel without the Citadel being breached. Although, most of the time, if a capital ship was sunk, it did also involve a Citadel breach, or several. But there are ways of doing it. Now, with something like Warrior, where the Citadel runs quite high in the hull, it's a very difficult proposition. But as you get into the Dreadnought period and then the fast battleship period, it does become slightly easier, because now the belt armor isn't going all the way to the upper decks. So you essentially have a, roughly speaking, rectangular box sitting low in the ship. And at that point, your buoyancy, if you are able to remain buoyant, might be described as, poke a bunch of holes in the waterline at each end. Water will come in and fill up the bow and the stern, but the Citadel's buoyancy will keep the ship afloat, and the water will get up to a certain level, and that'll be it. But that level might be below the upper deck level of the Citadel. If you can get water in above the Citadel as well, you may now make the ship negatively buoyant. Or you could try and capsize the ship, again letting water in the top where it's not supposed to be, and by flooding the entirety of the ship from the upper decks down, or effectively thereof, you could also sink the ship. Now, you could do this by just blowing lots of holes in one side of the ship. You could do this by blowing lots of holes generally in the ship, and the roll of the ship, perhaps with more holes in one side than the other, could lead to a free surface effect as the water sloshes around inside, and that could capsize the ship. You could go with potentially completely riddling one end of the ship and making it go bow or stern down, which could then lead to water overtopping the ship on the upper decks and flowing down on top of the Citadel and then spreading forward and forward, or aft and aft, which to a certain degree is pretty much what did in Lutzow. And of course, your enemy can try and counter that by counter-flooding port or starboard tanks if you're being hit predominantly on one side or the other, or even counter-flooding by flooding forward or aft tanks if you're being hit primarily forward or aft. And the aim at this point is to keep the water relatively low down in the ship in the unarmoured, or, in the case of distributed armour, partially armoured sections. If this fails, then regardless of the fact you might technically have reserve buoyancy sufficient to keep your ship afloat in a riddled condition, if your ship ends up being dragged down by the bow, by the stern, or rolled over, you can still be sunk. However, it requires quite a lot of damage, and quite a lot of rather selective damage, and a bit of good luck on your enemy's part to pull that off, as compared to a Citadel which can't keep you afloat, in which case just shoot the ship and it will eventually go down no matter what that Citadel does. And there are also other benefits, such as the fact that if your Citadel is large enough to keep your ship afloat, it's going to have a larger internal volume, therefore the unarmoured or partially armoured portions which could be riddled are going to necessarily have a smaller volume, which means there is less water that can get into them, which in turn might make your counter-flooding or pumping efforts considerably easier, for example. Brendan Buersdorf asks, I'm curious, how good was the conversion of the Portuguese ironclad Vasco de Gama that took place in the early 1900s? It seems like they were trying to do what the Ottomans did with their ironclad Masudae and somehow make it more viable. Was this conversion better for the Portuguese, or was it a waste of money rather than just buying a new armoured cruiser or battleship? Vasco da Gama's conversion was probably one of the most radical and comprehensive conversions ever done to a warship, and when I eventually get around to covering her, you'll see, what she looks like before and what she looks like after. They're almost like two completely different ships. Now, I suppose you could argue that given the amount of resources and money that would have gone into converting her, you might have been better off building a new armoured cruiser or battleship. However, I'm going to put a very big caveat on that. The fact is, Vasco da Gama was not a very large ship in the first place, and she also wasn't really supposed to go anywhere particularly far. She could sail around if she wanted to. However, her main job was to defend Lisbon. So essentially, she's more of an ocean-capable coastal defense ship. And in that role, I think her refit wasn't too bad an option. I mean, one of the really radical things they did, which you really don't see on the vast majority of these kind of conversions, was they completely removed her iron belt, because she was originally an ironclad built in the 1870s, and in her 1900s era refit, they replaced it outright with modern steel. I think per ton, that probably makes her one of the most heavily protected vessels ever built, because she didn't even break 3,000 ton displacement, but she had an armor belt thickness that, thickness-wise at least, was on a par with a number of battleships, 4 times her displacement. And, okay, admittedly, the formulas might be very slightly different, but actually, theoretically, maximum belt armor thickness, assuming they kept the same thickness, which I'm pretty sure they did from what I've been able to read, is actually equivalent to a British battlecruiser. And, they outmassed poor old Vasco da Gama by about a factor of 8. And if you were trying to buy a new armoured cruiser or battleship to defend Lisbon, honestly, I don't think anyone's going to really be building you a 3,000-4,000 ton coast defence ship with that level of protection. I mean, obviously it could be done. They refitted Vasco da Gama that way, but it would be difficult to find someone who would pull that off. So I think actually they got a pretty good deal out of it, because they ended up with a ship that essentially could tank rounds from almost anything that wasn't a full-scale capital ship, which for a navy like the Portuguese navy at the beginning of the 20th century, that's a pretty good deterrent. It essentially means that enemy cruisers are at a serious disadvantage if they try and come after your capital, and anything smaller than that's a disadvantage. And honestly, if someone comes after you with, a full squadron of full-scale battleships to force their way into Lisbon, yeah, okay, at that point Vasco da Gama isn't really going to be much more than a roadblock. But hey, you just forced your opponent to commit, well, at that point, looking at a typical pre-dreadnought displacement, maybe 20 times the ship's displacement in warships to get past it. That's not a bad return on investment. Joao Rita asks, regarding ship trials after construction or refit, I understand such tests can be made to run ships and their components to their maximum. Are there any examples of the tests going so wrong that a ship is severely damaged or even sunk? In the realm of severely damaged, it depends what your metric is. There were ships on trials that were severely damaged by going aground, for example. Sometimes that was just inexperience of the crew. Sometimes that would be, hey, we should have turned, why aren't we turning? Or we should have turned, why are we turning slowly? When someone had badly miscalculated the ship's turning radius, or the steering gear had broken down, or maybe the ship was just so large no one had really had experience navigating a ship that size before, and had miscalculated when exactly they needed to turn to make a specific turn. Other times, obviously, you have, let's say, the gunnery tests on Nelson and Rodney. That caused a fair bit of blast damage. Now, would you characterize that as severe damage? Well, it didn't compromise the ship or put it at risk of sinking, but there was a lot of clear-up work to do afterwards, and a lot of remedial work as well. And more than one ship that went out on trials came back with one or more engines not working, either through boiler failure, the engines packing up, or something equally dramatic. But again, do you classify that as severe damage or just part of the ship has broken? Your mileage may vary, and therefore your answer there may vary. In terms of trials where a ship outright sank because of something wrong with their components, that is much, much rarer. It did happen occasionally, but most of the victims tended to be submarines. Perhaps understandably, because a submarine's entire point is to be able to go under the water. And if they're on trials and they go under the water and something goes dramatically wrong, they tend to stay under the water, which is not good. Hence why there's a picture of a K-class, because if you remember from the K-class video, one of the subs was going out on trials and, well, it got stuck at the bottom of Garelock, or Garelock, or however the heck it is you pronounce it. This is the problem with the UK. Pronunciation changes every 20 or 30 miles. Daniel Silverthorne asks, what did the Japanese think had happened to allow the Americans to successfully engage them at Midway before the truth of Captain Rochefort's team came out? Did they believe that the Americans had simply known they would come and stage carriers there to intercept them, or did they believe something else had happened? Now, I don't know for sure. I suspect someone like John Parshall probably has done a lot more digging into the exact detail of the aftermath of Midway and its fallout amongst the Japanese Naval High Command. However, there are 4 possible reasons or interpretations that would allow the Japanese to believe that there was a reasonable explanation for the Americans being off of Midway, of which 2, I think, at least have a certain degree of supporting evidence that's quite easy to find. So, for example, one of them, the Japanese could have concluded, we got unlucky, an American submarine spotted us while we were on the way. That's entirely possible. Japanese doctrine held that you should try and use submarines for reconnaissance to spot when the enemy fleet is leaving, so the Americans might have done exactly the same thing, so they knew we were coming, that's why the carriers were there. But, at least as far as I've been able to find, although that is a perfectly logical deduction, I haven't been able to find any of the Japanese admirals specifically saying, oh, that's probably what happened. Of course, Nagumo thought absolutely that his plans hadn't been discovered until the absolute last moment, but we're talking about, back home, Yamamoto, etc., etc. A second potential option would be that the Japanese could have thought themselves just unlucky, i.e. the Americans didn't know that the Japanese were coming for Midway. But if you look at it in a broader context, the Japanese knew roughly what size the American carrier fleet was. But when they encountered the Americans at Coral Sea, which of course was also partially thanks to code breaking, they ran into 2 carriers. They didn't know where the Doolittle raid had come from, bear in mind, so they didn't know Enterprise and Hornet were off doing that. So although it was unexpected to run into 2 American carriers, the fact that they ran into 2 rather than 4 or 5 was interesting, because of course that wasn't what the Japanese would have thought would be a full-strength defensive deployment. It actually was, thanks to the Doolittle raid, but they didn't know that. So they could have concluded, well, we know that American carriers run additional aircraft to their island bases, trying to reinforce Wake Island, although that didn't pan out, etc., etc. So if they're using their aircraft carriers for ferry missions, well, logically you would send another carrier for defensive purposes, and bear in mind they never actually saw all 3 American carriers and identified them as 3 separate carriers all in one place at one time during the Battle of Midway. So they might have concluded that what they'd run into was, oh, there's an aircraft ferry mission that was just so happened to be happening at the time, and when we attacked, that the American carriers went, actually, you know what, we'll attack with our air groups. And they could convince themselves of that by perhaps looking at the number of aircraft on Midway, including, of course, some of the early Avengers, and going, well, clearly these are the aircraft that the American carriers were flying off to Midway, and they just, were nearby when we showed up and decided to come after us. And then for the 2 that perhaps have a little bit more supporting evidence, going back to Coral Sea, they've only seen 2 carriers. they may very well have deduced, given the fact that you also had, remember, in the run-up to Midway, a war game where a Japanese planner actually, not exactly, but almost simulated what actually would happen at Midway. They may have concluded that the Americans sat down and went, you know what? If I was a Japanese admiral, where would I attack next? And then spread their carrier forces out to defend the most likely targets. And ultimately, if you look at a map of Japanese advances just before the Battle of Midway, well, it's fairly obvious, actually, that Midway would make a good stepping stone, perhaps even to attack Pearl Harbor again, and certainly to shore up the Central Pacific defenses, and continuing your campaign in the Southeast Pacific, i.e. the force that would eventually lead to the Battle of Coral Sea, also makes a degree of sense. So the Japanese could have concluded, well, if the Americans only put 2 carriers down at Coral Sea, maybe they just went, well, we think the Japanese will attack here, here, and here, so they spaced their carriers out, and they concluded from their own first principles that Midway was a target, and there were carriers waiting for an attack. They didn't know we were going to attack, but it was a hedge bet that paid off for them. And then the last one, which potentially has the strongest evidence for it, is to do with radio. Now, on their way to Midway, the Japanese fleet went through a very thick fog patch and had to do course correction. That required the use of radios. In the aftermath of Midway, again, at least as far as I've been able to discover, the Japanese were very, very much more tight on radio discipline than they had been before, and they'd been fairly tight before Midway as well, within reason. So that seems to indicate to me that at least some of the blame they may have put on the American carriers showing up at Midway could be because they thought, well, we were a little bit loose with our radio discipline, and maybe a submarine didn't spot us, but maybe an aircraft far away, or a submarine far away, or even long-distance receivers picked up that radio transmission and went, there shouldn't be a radio transmission in the middle of the sea. This is suspicious. We shall send defensive forces to Midway to defend it from whatever this is. So, various reasons. I say the last two have a little bit of evidence behind them, but I would also say probably someone like John Parshall or similar will probably know a bit more detail about exactly what Japanese High Command was thinking. Ian Carr asks, how much longer would the Swordfish have been in service if the war against Germany had not been won within the actual timescale, ignoring nuclear events? Could anything replace it off escort carriers in the North Atlantic until the widespread advent of the helicopter? I think it might have served a little bit longer, but perhaps not too much longer. I mean, a lot of it depends on how exactly the war in Germany is going, because if we say use a departure point of the D-Day landings and say, well, in our hypothetical example, the advance into Germany is much, much slower. That's a very different scenario to there's pockets of German resistance. Maybe the Germans put up a little bit of a better fight against the Red Army and the heart of Germany, stays fighting until 1946 or something like that. Because in the latter scenario, well, all the ports and harbours where the U-boats would be sorting from have been taken or neutralised, so the Swordfish would probably get taken out of service at pretty much the rate it was historically. Whereas if Germany still has substantial portions of its coastline available, and therefore U-boat pens and so forth, and perhaps even a holdout or two in France, available for operation for substantial numbers of submarines into late 45, that's a different matter. Then you might see the Swordfish hang around for considerably longer, but anti-submarine warfare versions of the Avenger were in the process of being developed, and the Avenger could also fly from escort carriers. So I suspect probably towards the end of 45, the Swordfish would have been stood down in favour of anti-submarine Avengers. But of course, the other thing you've got to bear in mind is that even if Germany has some of its submarine bases still active in a holdout scenario, the Allies have a lot of land-based airfields considerably closer to German-held ports, by 1945. And so much as actually some Swordfish were based on land at that period, you wouldn't necessarily have to worry so much about escort carriers, although obviously there would still be some. A lot of anti-submarine work would be being done by much bigger, heavier, more well-equipped aircraft, pretty much just keeping up a 24/7 orbit just off of German sub-bases. So even with electroboats and stuff, the need for the Swordfish, the necessity, would have continued to decrease at a fairly rapid rate. Glenn Ricafrente asks, what proportion of the Japanese fleet was the combined fleet at Tsushima? Did the Japanese put all their ships in for this one battle? And if they'd lost a significant number of the combined fleet in a mutual kill scenario with the 2nd Pacific Squadron, what happens next? Who wins the war? The Japanese commitment to Tsushima, at least as far as capital ships went, was essentially total. They had every single pre-dreadnought battleship and every single armoured cruiser still afloat at that battle. They started the war with a few more, but a bunch of them had hit mines. But yeah, in terms of capital ship strength, the traditional battle line strength, which of course in the pre-dreadnought period did include armoured cruisers, the Japanese had put literally everything they had into it. The only things they had that would be notionally classified as capital ships that didn't show up were the various ironclads, which obviously significantly predated their pre-dreadnoughts, including one or two that they'd acquired in the Sino-Japanese War. But there were good reasons for not including them. They were far too slow and nowhere near as well equipped, so they wouldn't have been able to take a meaningful part in the battle anyway. Now, in a scenario where they lose a significant amount of the combined fleet in a mutual kill with the 2nd Pacific Squadron, the Japanese will still win the war, because remember, they've neutralized the 1st Pacific Squadron, and if they've now annihilated the 2nd Pacific Squadron, the Russians basically have zero sea power in the Pacific. Now, even if the combined fleet has taken an absolutely almighty pounding, in theory, since you didn't specify complete kill, you just said a large number of their ships, they will still have some modern warships, and ultimately they can break out the old ironclads as well. Essentially, the Japanese will have some form of sea power available, which means they can still guarantee their supply lines in terms of, munitions and food, as well as troops, in the battle on the mainland. And of course, they can also move those troops around, because even a really bad showing at Tsushima isn't going to affect their transport fleet. So ultimately, the Japanese will still win. It will just not be quite as glorious for the Japanese Navy. And finally for this week, Fechtler's Fickle Fictile Fettler, 4th Finest Fettler, Fechtler Forged for Foreign Fictile Fettling Forays, yes, that is indeed a username, asks, how would a deck-launched Ohka compare in tactical capability to the Long Lance and a normal, quote-unquote, catapult-launched kamikaze aircraft? I recall from an ancient Drydock you saying something about Japan not mounting them on surface ships. Is this true? And if so, was it simply a factor of what ships, or was there some other reason why it wasn't implemented? Well, a catapult-launched kamikaze is going to be relatively ineffective, because if you're talking about catapults as in on battleships and so forth, any such aircraft is of necessity probably going to be relatively lightweight and low performance and carrying a relatively small payload. Now, yes, there were a few high performance float planes and so forth that were designed for catapult use, but by and large, the majority of catapult launched kamikaze aircraft are going to be relatively easy targets for AA, and even if they somehow make it through, they're not going to have anywhere near the impact of some of the higher performance aircraft the Japanese had on hand for that kind of strategy. Whereas the Ohka obviously is fast, it's a fairly low profile, and it carries a very big boom, so it would obviously be better than that. Compared to a Long Lance, the range is not massively greater. Now, there was a specific model of Ohka that I'm referring to, which was designed for surface launch, not from ships, but from submarines, which makes a very slightly sane amount of sense. And that would have a somewhat shorter operational range than something that's air-launched, because of course it would have to be building up from 0 airspeed and constantly flying in the somewhat thicker air down at near enough sea level, as opposed to the air-launched ones, which launch with a bit of airspeed and can obviously use gravity to get up a bit more speed, and of course are initially launching in the slightly higher rarefied atmosphere. Not as high as these days, but obviously still it helps some. So the range difference between a deck-launched Ohka and a long lance is not actually all that much. However, of course, the Ohka covers that distance quite a bit faster and can adjust its course, whereas the long lance would be a lot slower and can't, although the long lance is less likely to be spotted. You're not going to shoot down a long lance with 40mm Bofors, for example, but the Ohka probably would be fairly hard to stop. So utility-wise, on a per-shot basis, the Ohka deck launching would probably have a slightly greater effectiveness than long lances. But of course, the flip side is you could probably carry more long lances than you could Ohkas. Weight aside, the Ohka takes up more space. But yes, you're correct. The Japanese didn't really seem to think about mounting them on surface ships, partly because, what ships were they going to stick them on? They had a few left at the end, but not really that many. But part of the other issue was, when you look at the submarine launch version, simply stealth. If a submarine has an Ohka aboard, there is a reasonable chance that the sub might survive long enough in range, undetected, to launch an Ohka or two. Whereas a surface ship loaded with one or more of these things, trundling to within, a couple of dozen miles of a US fleet, that's going to be spotted the vast majority of the time, and it's going to be attacked. And spoiler alert, having a bunch of fueled up explosive packed suicide aircraft or human-guided missiles strapped to your deck is not a recipe for survival for any length of time when a bunch of Hellcats come barreling in, lobbing 50 cal ammunition at you. So deck-mounted Ohkas, unfortunately, really are more a suicide weapon for the ship than they are for the pilots, although they probably go up with the ship as well. About the only potential effective use that I can think of would be, you'd have to be extremely complex in your planning, but maybe would be to take one of the larger surviving destroyers, or maybe even something like Kitakami, and slap half a dozen Ohkas onto it in exchange for pretty much all the other armament, and then deploy it at high speed at night. Now, you are probably still going to get detected by American radar-equipped vessels, but hopefully that might buy you enough cover to get within range of your targets. But the reason I say this was going to have to be very complicated is that you'd also most likely have to have one of those specialist lone pilots that the Japanese really liked to use towards the end of the war to simultaneously sneak close to the US fleet and use flares to highlight the US ships, or else conduct the operation on a really moonlit night where you don't necessarily have to worry about flares and stuff to find your targets. Then you could ripple off your Ohkas, and without the benefit of daylight and with a certain element of surprise, you might get a reasonable chance of hitting something big and important. But equally, there is a reasonable chance that you would just get spotted during the day on your approach and attacked and sunk, or if the enemy fleet is close enough to the Japanese home islands that you don't really have to worry about sailing during the day, there's still a good chance a radar picket destroyer finds you, puts a 5-inch shell somewhere on your deck, and you go up long before you can launch anything. And that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. Hope you found that interesting. And, well, next week will be the Patreon Drydock for the end of September. So, see you then. It'll be a long one.